Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 15, The Golden Flying Machine. A wall of sand spilled into the city as the main gates were pulled open. O'Neill unceremoniously walked out of the city, leading his soldiers. He was now absolutely determined to return to the pyramid, as if he knew exactly what he was going to do when he got there. Daniel, much less eager to go, dilly-dallied at the gate, saying goodbye to Shaori, trying to explain to her that he was going to come back. Kawalsky turned back and shouted at him, "On the double, Jackson!" "Forget him. He's useless to us now," O'Neill said. Kawalsky did a double-take. He didn't understand O'Neill's attitude. He glanced over at Brown, both of them thinking the same thing. The U.S. Marine Corps does not leave its people behind. Cardinal rule, even when the squad considered them annoying jerks. Eventually, Daniel tore himself away and jogged after the squad, trying to catch up. "Hey, wait up!" he yelled, feeling mistakenly that his discovery of the cartouche had earned him full membership to the team. Kowalski turned to watch Daniel coming toward them, spotting something else in the dunes behind him. "Colonel O'Neill, it looks like we've made some friends." Skara and his gang of shepherd boys came riding up behind Daniel, clinging to the sides of Littlebit, ready to enlist. "Jackson," O'Neill barked, "get rid of those kids." O'Neill pressed on with his march as Daniel stood and yelled at the boys in their language. They understood him well enough and shuffled their feet in the sands for a minute, neither following nor turning back. A few minutes later, when O'Neill turned to check, the kids were still there, trailing the soldiers by about 100 yards. "Damn it, Jackson, I told you to get rid of those kids." "I tried," Daniel barked right back at him. "Sir," Kowalski stepped in to make a suggestion. "We could get there a lot faster if they gave us a ride." O'Neill was somewhere else. He didn't hear a single word of what his lieutenant had said. Still staring at the boys, he unholstered his pistol, took aim, and fired 3 quick shots. "What are you doing? Stop!" Daniel demanded, but he was too far away to do anything. O'Neill fired 3 more times, his bullets ripping up the ground right in front of the mastage, scaring her into a sudden awkward dance. The boys jumped off in all directions, hiding behind the dunes. When the shooting was done, everyone looked in angry horror at O'Neill. "What are you doing shooting at children? What's the matter with you?" Daniel went into a paroxysm, ballistic. "What if you hit one of them?" Kowalski and Brown kept quiet, but they were asking themselves the same questions. None of it made any dent on O'Neill, who immediately turned and continued the march, reloading as he went. Skara poked his head over the dune and watched as the team slowly disappeared deeper into the desert. His heart felt like galloping hooves inside his slender frame. His new friend, the man in the black beret, had betrayed him. When Nabe flopped down next to him, wondering what they would do next, Skara turned his head away, even though it was obvious he was crushed. O'Neill put Brown in charge of counting out the pace. Pressing for time, he ordered them to march as the armies of Rome had 2,000 years ago, sprinting for 50 paces, then walking for 50, then sprinting again. In this way, they covered the 2-hour trek to the pit in about 35 minutes. 20 minutes later, O'Neill looked up and saw something that froze him in his tracks. What in the... There were now 2 pyramids, one perched directly on top of the other. The golden walls of the upper pyramid, full of hieroglyph-like symbols, had opened into horizontal sections, revealing the complex machinery lying just below their surface. The golden flying machine that had stacked itself atop the pyramid seemed very ancient and very modern at the same time. It was obviously hollow on the inside, conically shaped, because it fit over the top of the lower structure like a golden shell. Only the bottom third of the first pyramid remained visible. "Looks like somebody was home after all," Brown said. "It's a spaceship," Daniel blurted out, drawing skeptical looks from his colleagues. "Well, maybe not a spaceship," he backpedaled, "but some sort of flying machine. It was on the wall of the catacomb." In fact, he was right the first time. The ship, fully self-contained, allowed Ra to fly between the far-flung mining operations he maintained in this corner of the universe. Although he hadn't been to this small planet for many years, he had come immediately to find out why the quartz shipment had not been made on time. O'Neill took off his small backpack and took out a pair of high-powered binoculars. The walls of the golden spacecraft were not built in one piece, but in movable sections. Soon after landing, the ship had unfolded and opened to its present size. Large sections split away from the main body and extended mechanically downward. In doing so, it revealed long strips of the complex machinery lying just below the golden surface. The colonel scanned the surrounding area for signs of life, but could detect none. On the ridge where the base camp had been, he spotted some half-buried equipment scattered in the sand. A shred of canvas waved from an abandoned tent pole. Without telling anyone what he was planning, O'Neill grabbed a handful of flares from his backpack and started tucking them into his waistband. "Sir?" was all Kawalsky said. "I'm going inside," he informed them, checking the action on his automatic rifle. That didn't make any sense. Why waltz into a potential ambush before you'd gathered as much information as possible? It was obvious to Kawalsky they should first try establishing radio contact with Ferretti's team. He tried to propose the idea to O'Neill, but O'Neill was already gone, moving toward the pyramid like a human torpedo. He seemed completely oblivious to his soldiers supposedly under his command. Kawalsky watched him go, then surprised Daniel by saying, "What are we supposed to do, stand here and hold our privates? I've had just about enough of that guy." The big soldier unscrewed the cap of his canteen and slugged a long drink, while Brown and Daniel looked at each other, not quite sure what was going on. "I guess we should go after him, back him up. What do you think?" Kowalski looked at Brown for his opinion. "Well, I'm not staying out here by myself," said the technology officer. Kowalski realized that leaving Brown here with Daniel was tantamount to leaving him by himself. Kowalski held up his rifle and turned to Daniel. "You know how to pull a trigger?" he asked. Daniel forced a smile. "I don't really understand what's happening here," he said. "Welcome to the armed forces, pal," Kowalski said before dumping himself over the edge of the dune and chugging after the colonel. A few minutes later, O'Neill was at the base of the ramp. He took up a position behind one of the obelisks and took a minute to assess the situation. Everything outside the pyramid was still. He peered up at the strange triangular structure perched like a Louisiana bayou pole house atop the Great Pyramid. What Daniel said about it being a spacecraft seemed ludicrous, but it was better than any explanation he could come up with himself. "Colonel O'Neill, slow down a minute." Kowalski came running up to the obelisk. "This is all screwed up. We want to back you up, but you gotta tell us what's up. It's our job to follow orders, but you've got a responsibility to keep us informed." Kowalski tried to maintain a tone of voice somewhere between obedient and threatening, loyal and mutinous. "You don't want to go in? That's fine with me. But do me a favor and stay down so you don't give me away," he said, glancing toward the upper pyramid. He was getting ready to go when Kowalski reached out and caught him by the arm. "You're not going in there alone, just like we're not leaving Jackson behind anywhere. Marines take care of their own." O'Neill was totally focused. Reach the equipment cart, retrieve the canisters from their hidden compartment, and initiate the detonation sequence. For the sake of everyone on Earth, nothing must interfere with that goal. He had hoped to leave the men well out in the dunes, hopefully sparing their lives. But now it was too late. He couldn't risk explaining the mission to them. They might try to interfere. They would have to be sacrificed. O'Neill looked blankly back at his lieutenant, and said as much as he could afford to. "I've got to get to the Stargate room," he said. "I wouldn't mind the help, but I'm going one way or the other." "Two teams?" Kawalsky asked, apparently satisfied. "Two teams," O'Neill announced. "Lieutenant, you and Brown take the rear." O'Neill took several quick breaths to oxygenate his blood, then, without warning, took off like a shot, running up the ramp at full speed. Daniel stayed in his crouched position, watching O'Neill go. "Will you move?" Kawalsky looked at Daniel like he was crazy. "Go!" Daniel went, but a second later he started asking himself what in the hell he was doing. Sprinting headlong into this recently re-inhabited pyramid right behind the psychotic colonel, he asked himself, wouldn't the smart thing be running in the opposite direction? The rifle Kawalsky had given him felt like a live eel in his hands. It was a struggle to keep a hold of the heavy alien object. He felt worse when he followed O'Neill into the shadows of the tall entryway and saw Ferretti's helmet laying next to the radio. He stopped and looked down for a minute, gulped, then took off chasing O'Neill. He caught up to where the colonel was crouched against a pillar. "Listen," O'Neill said. Daniel was gasping for air, but fear instantly taught him how to do so in complete silence. He was too scared to listen, so he watched O'Neill listening instead. "Good," he said, then spun around the corner and advanced 6 more columns in as many seconds. If Daniel had waited another second to follow him, he would have seen the shadow fall across the spot where they had been. Someone was just outside the pyramid, looking in through one of the square windows that ran the length of the entrance hall. It was Skara, standing on Nabe's shoulders. He caught a glimpse of the two figures, Kawalsky and Brown, as they darted past the window. When they were gone, he jumped into the sand and led the charge for the next window. Inside, O'Neill was standing stock still in the shadow between 2 pillars, checking forward, deciding on the best path to the Stargate. Daniel was only a few feet away, his back against the opposite pillar, facing back toward the entrance. As he waited for the colonel's instructions, he noticed something moving through the shadows of the cavernous hall. Just as he tried to say something, O'Neill sprinted away around the corner. Daniel flattened himself against the column and watched the huge figure step into the light. Daniel recognized him at once. It was Horus, the Egyptian god of the sky, the deity who sat at the side of Ra and helped to judge the worth of human souls in the land of the dead. He was just as the ancient Egyptians had depicted him, the athletic body of a man and the enormous head of a hawk. He wore armor on his shoulders, forearms, and shins. In his metal gloves he carried a 5-foot-long weapon. Daniel kept perfectly still until the shape disappeared again into the shadows. Farther back, Brown watched Kawalsky head off around one of the pillars. 2 counts later, he started to follow when, thwack! Something heavy came down on his head with a horrible cracking sound. Brown staggered, then went to his knees. He fought desperately to recover, tried to get up and run, but a powerful blast of white light spit from the end of a 5-foot rifle, shearing off the top of his shoulder. The force of it smashed him hard into one of the pillars, where he collapsed, bleeding and dazed. "Brown, report!" Kawalsky called out. "Where are you, man?" Brown heard him, but was too dazed. In too much pain to respond, he pushed himself across the floor toward the pillars, crawling toward the light streaking in through the small, square windows. He managed to get himself under the very window Skara was peering in through. The boy, standing once more on Nabe's shoulders, got a ghoulishly good view as a second Horus guard turned the corner and bore down on the defenseless soldier. He carried a pole-like weapon, a scepter that flared out at one end like a cobra's hood surrounding a large amethyst jewel set in the middle. The warrior raised the weapon, a rifle, and brought the butt end of it down on Brown's neck. As soon as he heard the shrill whine of the first shot, O'Neill hit the deck, belly sliding for cover. He was near the end of the entrance hall, about to enter the sloping grand gallery, crouched and silently waiting for word to come from behind. He had no intention of giving away his position by calling to his soldiers. He couldn't wait any longer. Silently, he headed for the doorway leading into the grand gallery when a grenade-sized ball of light came fishtailing through the darkness, heading straight for him. He leapt out of the way, and the shot exploded against the wall behind him with concussive force, raining scraps of granite on the floor. Kawalsky ducked out from his hiding place and fired blindly toward the area where he'd seen the power burst originate. Then, from the side, he felt his assault rifle clubbed from his hands by a single heavy blow. He turned and came face to face with his attacker. It was another one of the Horus soldiers. The creature's large head, a stylized image of a hawk, seemed to be made from the same metallic substance as his body armor. The parts of him that weren't covered were immensely muscular. Standing too close to fire the long rifle, the warrior brought it up with both hands into Kowalski's chin, snapping the man's head back violently. But Kowalski reached out and grabbed onto the weapon before his opponent could step back and fire. The two of them began to grapple at close quarters, which built Kowalski's confidence. Hand-to-hand combat was his specialty, and this opponent, although skillful, seemed no match for him. The hawk had a unique weapon that kept Kowalski off balance. As the two men battled for control of the weapon, he used his sharp beak to poke and slash. Kowalski countered by forcing the rifle upward, then attacking the man's unarmored midsection. Using the staff for extra leverage, he landed a vicious kick to the other man's stomach, doubling him over. He twisted the weapon free and was about to attack again when he was hit from behind, a sledgehammer blow nailing him right on the crown of his head. In the liquid, woozy moment before he blacked out, Kowalski turned around and looked into another pair of expressionless bird eyes staring down at him. He realized too late that the enemy was working in pairs. Daniel had watched the whole thing. He was standing a few strides away, petrified by fear. The fight was over so quickly, and now Kowalski, the strongest man he'd ever met, had succumbed to these impossible yet utterly familiar creatures. In all the time he'd studied Egyptology, it had never once occurred to him that ancient gods might in fact be real. Inching backward deeper into the shadows, he listened to his own deafening pulse pounding against his eardrums. As soon as Kowalski had fallen, the twin Horus warriors had separated, retreating into darkness. His mind started scattering in 1,000 directions. Adrenaline racing through his bloodstream, Daniel took a deep breath and tried to focus. When the thing comes back, he told himself, use the rifle. Concentrate. Point the rifle at the head. No, at the stomach. Kowalski kicked him in the stomach, and then pull the trigger. Then there was something behind him. He felt it coming around the corner of the pillar, but it was moving fast, and before he could react, it took him. A powerful hand clapped down over his mouth and pulled his head back to expose his throat. Daniel's eyes bugged to silver dollar size, sure he was a goner, waiting to feel the ice-hot knife blade slit open his throat. Then came a whisper. I need your help. O'Neill's lips were practically inside his ear. We're going to the Stargate, and you're going to cover me. Understand? The colonel waited until he felt Daniel nod yes. Then, still cradling the head under his arm like a football, he leaned around the pillar to check the hallway. When the coast looked clear, he stood Daniel up and pushed him up against the wall just hard enough to capture his full attention. He could see that Daniel was on the verge of freaking out, so he spoke to him in a deliberately calm, almost relaxed way. This is how it's going to go. You follow me forward, but keep looking back and shoot at anything that follows us. Now let's move, fast. He reached down and clicked the safety switch on Daniel's rifle to the off position. A second later, they were running at top speed deeper into the pyramid. A voice screeched inside Daniel's head. What was O'Neill making him do? This was only the entrance hall. They weren't even close to the Stargate room, and the rest of the way would be in the pitch black. Daniel's stride began to falter until he realized that the alternative to sticking with O'Neill was facing the Horaces by himself. He increased his speed and raced beyond the reach of the last light coming in the square windows. O'Neill broke open a flare as he ran, and began waving it erratically over his head to make himself a more difficult target. As soon as he had his bearings, he tomahawked the flare far out ahead of him. When they ran past, Daniel sped up to get out of the light, then turned to run backward, watching for anyone who might try to follow. They took the rest of the Grand Gallery at full speed. O'Neill used another flare when he guessed they were coming to the hallway with the medallions embedded in the floor and ceiling. He held the flare until they came to the doorway, then lobbed it through the medallion hall into the Stargate room. Before the flare had stopped rolling, O'Neill was inside, rifle first, looking everywhere for the enemy. No one else was in the room. There was still time. O'Neill ran to the equipment cart, fishing the claw out of a pocket in his fatigues. Daniel entered the room a second later, trying to stay close, trying to stay alive. "Get back to the door," O'Neill hissed, hardly turning to look. "Colonel, I saw the thing that got Kawal." The next thing Daniel knew, O'Neill had a pistol pointing right into his face. "Do it, or you're a dead man." Daniel practically fell backward. He was sure O'Neill meant it. He retreated until he was at the edge of the flare's light, then squatted down near the tall doorway. He pointed his rifle uncertainly toward the shadows of the Grand Gallery, and waited for the Horaces to attack. He glanced over his shoulder at O'Neill. "What are you doing over there?" Daniel could see that O'Neill was working something into the floorboards of the offloaded equipment cart. "Come on, O'Neill, let's get out of here." Ignoring him, the colonel continued working until he got the hatch door to pop open, revealing the secret compartment built into the vehicle. He pulled it open, fully prepared to insert the orange key. The compartment was empty. The canisters had been taken out without tripping the fail-safe system, the detonator. O'Neill stared in disbelief at the empty space. Then and there he realized he was facing a superior enemy. A moment later, Daniel saw the feat. Stepping into the doorway were two of the huge Falcon men, their helmets glistening in the chemical light of the flare. They held their ground as a third figure, taller by a foot, advanced slowly out of the darkness and stepped between them, his weapon aimed. Both Daniel and O'Neill recognized him at once. It was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. "Put the gun down. It's over, Jackson." Daniel nervously complied with the order. As Anubis approached, Daniel got his first face-to-face look at one of these ghoulish, horrific, impressive creatures. The jackal-headed warrior strode into the light with a pompous, ceremonial style. As he walked past, Daniel studied this flesh and iron incarnation of what he had always assumed to be a myth. The warrior's head was especially disconcerting. It appeared to be both inorganic, sculpted from some metallic or quartzose material, and at the same time, alive. Daniel thought it might be some kind of helmet constructed from biomorphic metal. Could they be cyborgs? Anubis continued across the room until he was a pace from O'Neill, then slid the palm of his hand along the underside of the long, ancient-looking rifle. As he did so, a group of flanges, the ribs of the narrow gun barrel, flared open, making the weapon ready to fire. O'Neill didn't flinch. The two of them stared at each other for a long beat, almost as if they recognized one another until the strange warrior gave a signal to the pair of Horaces. It was eerily similar to the pictures Daniel had studied the night before in the catacombs. Anubis was the leader of the other gods. They seemed to work for him. The two Horus guards stepped forward, each grabbing one of the intruders roughly by the collar with their powerful hands. Holding their hands low to the ground, they forced their captives to walk stooped low to the ground. If they tripped, which both of them did, the Horuses dragged them effortlessly across the floor. They moved away from the Stargate and into the next room, the hallway with medallions set into the floor and ceiling. The guards pulled the Americans onto the large, round plate. O'Neill, alert, cooperating to buy time, noticed the jackal making an adjustment to his armored cuff. On the back of the wristband, a mounting shaped like a scarab beetle held a large, clear jewel in place. The jackal pressed down on the gem. The next second, a needle of blue light jabbed through the dark hallway, rising from the edge of the medallion to its twin on the ceiling high above. The beam traced around the circumferences of the medallions, leaving a razor-thin curtain of wavering blue light in its wake, surrounding the 5 men standing on the medallion. As soon as the light completed its circuit and closed into a cylinder, there was an upward rush of bright white light that seemed to lift them off the ground. Daniel and O'Neill both felt a familiar tingling burn and a sudden escape from the prison of gravity. The same disorienting experience they'd undergone during their trip to this planet, the sensation of stargating. Clearly, the medallions were based on the same technologies that governed the huge quartz rings. When the rising flare of white light was above their heads, they found themselves in a different room, standing on an identical medallion. In the near-complete darkness, Daniel adjusted his glasses and noticed they were surrounded on 3 sides by the outstretched wings of a statue. The menacing form looming over them stood at least 8 feet tall and was wrought from a single block of lustrous black stone. Daniel recognized the unpleasant receptionist as the Egyptian deity Khnum, the ram-headed god. Daniel correctly guessed he was directly above the medallion hall, inside the strange craft that had perched itself atop the pyramid. The Horus guard tightened his grip on Daniel's collar, twisting the fatigue-green shirt closed around his throat like a choke leash. Once more, he and O'Neill were stumbling forward with their heads lower than their hips. They moved across a polished floor, their captor's armor clanking softly in the darkness. The echoing acoustics told Daniel that the room around them was large enough to make their sounds seem very small. The clang of a large handbell pealed out of the darkness ahead of them. A moment later, the entire chamber filled with a low-pitched growl, a rumbling mechanical timpani roar. Glaring light scissored into the room from several directions at once as giant panels, 80-foot-long plates of the pyramid's thick exterior walls, began sliding open as daintily as 12 small earthquakes. They were in a long, rectangular room with a very high ceiling, like a primitive cathedral. Giant faces looked down at them from the walls, sculpted delicately into the slender pillars supporting the ceiling down one end of the room. The tiled floor was an elaborate symmetrical mosaic. As the overhead panels continued sliding open, Daniel could see a golden throne, elaborately sculpted and embedded with precious stones. The throne sat on a platform at the top of a flight of stairs. Directly above hung a giant sun disk embossed with an udyat, the Eye of Ra. It was identical to the one that hung above the main square in Nagata, except this one appeared to be fashioned of solid gold. When they were halfway to the throne, Horus yanked back on Daniel's collar and forced him to the floor. O'Neill scuffled briefly with his keeper until Daniel urged him in a sharp whisper. "Just kneel," he counseled. Reluctantly, O'Neill turned and let himself slowly drop to his knees, looking defiantly at Anubis the whole while, carefully shaping the misperception that he would offer only symbolic, ego-salving resistance. By now, sunlight was pouring in from all directions, bathing the room in a warm yellow glow. 2 shafts of light climbed the walls on either side of the throne, eventually reaching the sun disk. A pair of doors behind the throne pulled open to reveal another smaller room behind. Children, ranging in age from 7 to 19 years old, moved through the door and out into the throne platform in a tight cluster. Wearing very little, the children were dressed in the fashion of ancient Egyptian courtiers. They were barefooted, with very short skirts around their hips and jeweled yoke collars hanging from their shoulders. They were protectively surrounding something at their center. When the children peeled away, they showed the visitors what they'd been fawning over, a chillingly accurate statue of the supreme pharaoh, Ra, the god of the sun. It was a breathtaking piece of work made entirely of gold, inlaid everywhere with precious jewels. Every detail, the long braided beard, the two snakes writhing from the headdress, and even the painted eyes, had been rendered with obsessive craftsmanship. Its perfectly proportioned arms lay folded across the chest, holding the traditional symbols of governance, the crook and the flail. The shepherd's crook signifying industry, and the flail representing domination, especially over slaves. The eerily expressionless face bore a vague resemblance to the one on Tutankhamun's famous death mask, but a single glimpse at this startlingly lifelike sculpture made the Tut mask seem amateurish by comparison. This far more threatening image made the greatest artifact of the Egyptians seem like a hopelessly sentimental cartoon. Daniel was wondering whether the guards would give him the opportunity to move closer and examine the lustrous idol when it suddenly moved. Cautiously and deliberately, the thing took a step. A mile deep in concentration, Daniel surfaced with a gasp. The figure moved with austere grace to the throne, clad in the style of the ancient pharaohs. Draped over the shoulders was a yoke dripping with ingots of red jasper and bright black onyx. Wrapped around the waist was a skirt, the stiff brocaded kilt that extended down to the knees. Pharaoh King Ra, Daniel whispered, somewhere between terror and delight. He and O'Neill looked at each other, then back to the bizarre creature still marching throneward at a tediously slow speed. Its skin, like Anubis's helmet, seemed to glow ever so slightly, emitting a ghostly pall. Daniel wondered whether he might be made of some of the same unidentifiable substance as the Stargate. When he arrived at the beautiful chair 20 paces from his guests, the shape suddenly sat down at normal human speed, then leaned forward, studying them. A minute passed before Ra languidly lifted a hand and flicked a finger toward Anubis. His soldier obeyed the command, reaching up to his throat and rolling a small tumbler tab with his index finger. Immediately, his large jackal head began to retract, beginning at the snout and moving backward. The frightening helmet was built from some type of smart metal, an alloy capable of remembering and executing complex sequences of commands. The headpiece peeled away in a section-by-section folding action until it revealed the human face beneath. It was the handsome, humorless face of a large youth. The mask continued to retract section by section until it was gone, receding back into the thin metallic yoke around the young man's neck. Neither of the Americans could believe it. They'd never seen technology even remotely similar to this. Daniel nervously looked up at the pharaoh, and after a long beat, Ra gave a lazy nod in the direction of the children. His minimal command was translated into a flurry of urgent whispers that soon led to 2 young children, no more than 10 years old, carrying out either side of a large tray. On the tray, dismantled into its constituent parts, was the device O'Neill had expected to find in the hidden compartment of the equipment cart. The nervous boys set the tray as close to the doomed visitors as they dared, before scampering back to the safety of their group. Daniel scrutinized the electronic fragments, uncertain what they were. He spoke out the side of his mouth to O'Neill, who was locked in a stare-down with the man of gold. "What is this stuff?" he asked, neither expecting nor receiving an answer. "Look, there are words." He leaned forward to inspect it. "They look like instructions." The next moment Daniel realized the printed words were from a scrap of a warning label, the international symbol for nuclear danger. It didn't take long for him to figure out what the wreckage on the tray was. "That's a bomb, isn't it? That's what you were looking for. What were you thinking?" Daniel's first reaction was anger. A bomb? How could O'Neill have done such a violent and stupid thing? but that emotion was quickly overwhelmed by the cold stab of fear running from his throat down to his belly. It suddenly occurred to him that both he and O'Neill were about to die. Daniel spent the next few moments looking for a way out of the situation. He decided that if he got the chance, he would explain that he'd had nothing to do with bringing the explosive. Also, he realized that no matter what happened, he'd gotten everything he'd come for. He'd answered the ancient riddle of the pyramids and proven, at least to himself, that his theories about ancient Egypt had been valid. He had overcome hyper-astronomical odds and bested many enemies to arrive at this very spot, the spot he was always meant to stand in. Whatever happened next, he was at peace with himself. Of course, he still wanted to get the hell out of there alive. Suddenly, the golden figure sat forward on his chair. A moment later, his entire shape began to mutate. His skin lost its golden veneer, and his helmet mask began to fold in upon itself, retracting behind his head. When the strange transformation was complete, there stood before them a darkly beautiful young man-child with long, braided hair. He appeared to be barely 20 years old and perfectly formed. His face was the picture of innocence. When the delicate face became visible, the soldiers who considered this youth their god put their faces to the floor exactly as the miners had done when they saw Daniel's medallion. With all eyes toward the floor, O'Neill saw his chance and attacked instantly. He leapt toward Anubis, jamming his shoulder viciously into the young man's side and seizing his weapon at the same time. Before he could recover, O'Neill chopped into the side of Anubis's neck with the butt of his rifle, collapsing him to the floor. In one swift motion, he duplicated the way Anubis slid his hand down the underside of the gun, snapping it open, then firing at the horse next to Daniel. The blast caught the guard's shoulder, pinwheeling him across the smooth floor. At the first sign of trouble, Ra ordered the children to surround him. Quickly, they formed a human shield around their leader. By the time O'Neill whirled around to fire, his weapon was pointed at a curtain of terrified children. O'Neill hesitated. He knew he should fire through the children, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He turned instead to fire at the second horse, who was just swinging his weapon into position. Daniel, horrified, saw that this second horse had the jump on O'Neill. He stepped into the no-man's land between the combatants and screamed in the soldiers' language not to do it. Too late. The second Horus figure discharged his weapon, and the shot ripped into Daniel's gut, killing him immediately. As his body fell to the floor, O'Neill had a clean shot and took it, blasting the guard backward. Then O'Neill made a second ruinous mistake. He took an instinctive step toward his fallen comrade, even though it was clearly too late to help him. This tiny moment of wavering in action was all Anubis needed to come from behind. As O'Neill turned to hunt down Ra, he was greeted by a bone-crunching kick to the chest that sent him flying backward. O'Neill was able to push himself up to his hands and knees, and looked ready to continue to fight. Anubis was approaching now, his helmet reactivated. Behind him, the falcon-headed warrior trained his firearm at the colonel. O'Neill struggled to regain his footing, but then suddenly collapsed like a sack of steak knives. Ra came out from behind the children and lifted a subtle gesture to Anubis, who went to O'Neill and looked him over. Just in case the man was feigning unconsciousness, Anubis reared back, then crushed into his head with the blunt end of his rifle. They watched him for a minute, waiting for a movement, a sign that he was still alive. Using his boot, Anubis rolled O'Neill over onto his back, then cautiously knelt down beside him. He reached out, and with one hand pinched O'Neill's nostrils closed, then clapped down over his mouth, preventing all breathing. Then he waited. O'Neill didn't know what to do. Even after the crushing blow to the head, he was indeed only pretending to be unconscious. As soon as they had regrouped, he ended the fight because he knew he couldn't win. Now Anubis was preventing him from breathing, and it took all his willpower not to make a grab for the jackal's weapon. He relaxed for a minute until his body began to convulse involuntarily, searching for oxygen. As soon as they knew he was still breathing, Anubis took his hand away. Now the best O'Neill could hope for was that they'd keep him alive in order to torture him. At least that would preserve the possibility of completing his mission. A minute later, O'Neill felt Anubis's strong hands seize his collar and begin dragging him across the floor of the chamber. As a precaution, a second soldier accompanied him, a few paces behind. It meant that O'Neill couldn't try to ambush his enemy, but it also meant they were afraid of him, vulnerable. Ra, still surrounded by his juvenile entourage, came across the floor to inspect Daniel's body. The shot had blasted a hole right through his chest. As Ra leaned over, he noticed something that made him intensely angry. He squatted down almost on top of the mangled corpse and stared at the medallion hanging around Daniel's neck. The Udyat, the Eye of Ra.